Good evening. So tonight's class is stories as Talmudic stories as they reflect culture. The first one that we did was Talmudic stories as art story. So elegant, carefully composed literary compositions that are designed to be an epitome of storytelling art. But to explain where we go tonight, I want to tell you a story and then retell you a story. So the story I want to tell you is a story that in this form is found in a collection of folk stories put together by Dov Noy, published in 1963 by University of Indiana Press, called Folk Tales of Israel. It's completely out of print, but you can find it on the used book websites, and it's a fun, good little collection of stories in English that were actually folk tales collected in the young state of Israel. And in this story, there are three brothers who get together and agree that in a year they're going to get together again and see who found the most interesting thing. And they all go away, and then one of them finds a magic carpet that can fly him anywhere he wants to go. He just tells it and they go. And one of them finds this marvelous telescope that can see anywhere a magic mirror that can see anywhere in the world. And the other one finds a garden where there's a magic apple that can bring dead people back to life. And they get together at the end of the year and they argue about who found the most marvelous thing. And the brother with the magic mirror says, well, let's look in the magic mirror and see what we can find. And they see that somewhere in some kingdom, they see a funeral procession. And so they're curious, and they all get on the flying carpet, and they say, take us to where that is. And the flying carpet takes all of them there, and they find out that it is the funeral procession for the local princess who died suddenly, and they don't know why, and everyone's very sad. And the brother with the magic apple somehow gives this unconscious dead woman the magic apple. But somehow he does it. And she comes back to life, and then the brothers start fighting about who she should marry. And the resolution to the riddle is that the princess says to the three brothers, you with the magic mirror, do you still have your magic mirror? And he says, why, yes, I do, it's right here. And you with the flying carpet, do you still have the flying carpet? Why, yes, I do, it's right here. And you with the magic apple, do you still have the magic apple? He says, no, I gave it to you. And she says, you two gave up something but didn't lose anything, and he gave up something that can't be replaced, and so he is the one that I will marry. So that's a classic piece of folklore that gets actually told in different communities in the world in different ways. That was a folk story that was collected in Israel in the 50s. When I tell that story, I change it a little bit. And instead of the brother finding a magic mirror, he goes off to Japan and gets involved in the optic industry, and he creates this satellite with a handheld receiver. So he has a personal satellite. He can see anything anywhere in the world. And the brother, instead of going and finding a magic carpet, he goes to Seattle and gets a job for Boeing in their research department and creates a personal jet engine, like a jet ski, but more. And then the other brother goes to the Amazon and starts working in pharmaceuticals, trying to find, working with things. So there's this folk story that has existed and been told for hundreds and maybe thousands of years by people. And I think it's an interesting story. But when I tell it, in order to catch the people who I'm talking to, I tell it in a way that makes sense for people in our modern idiom. Because I can tell a story about a magic mirror, but then that makes a story distant. What makes a story kind of fun is that it challenges people to take where they are and go a little bit further. And there are different categories of how people tell stories, and one of the stories is fairy tales, which are things that don't reflect the lives that we live. And another is fables. And fables are people from long ago. So it's about past things. And then there's another one that I never remember what the category is, that is stories that could conceivably happen in our lives if you stretch just a little bit. You might not see it every day, but it could happen. So a magic mirror and a flying carpet and a magic apple are not things that happen in our daily lives. But if I take that and turn that into very powerful optics with a satellite and a jet engine and advanced pharmaceuticals, suddenly those are things that you might, could happen. And it changes the way we relate to the story. So there is an aspect of stories in the Talmud that when we go to read them, we might just read them at face value. But it helps us to understand them a little bit more when we start to understand that the people who tell these stories in the Talmud, who were probably universally men, and probably universally men who were studying in the academy, that we understand some aspects of the Talmudic academy because the way they told the story reflects their lives. Or to put it differently, we can turn it on its head and say when we look at stories in the Babylonian Talmud, we have to remember that people tell stories from their lives, and so therefore there are aspects of life in the Babylonian academy, Lavrut, that reflected stories that reflect life in the Babylonian academy. So, I want to start with a story that is perhaps could be a fairy tale, in the sense of it tells about something that we absolutely have no experience of. So this first story is on the top of page 1. It is found in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Menachot 29b. I only brought the first half of this story. The second half of the story, just telling you, for like when the newspaper, they full disclosure. This isn't the whole story. There's more to it, but it doesn't necessarily tie into what we're doing, so I cut it off in the middle. The rest of the story is one of the stories of how Rabbi Akiva dies and is particularly gruesome, but wasn't necessarily relevant to what we're going to talk about. Would someone like to read in English or in Hebrew as you so choose? Jordan, thank you.
Rav Yehuda cited Rav. In the hour that Moshe went up to the heavens, he found the Holy Blessed One, who was sitting and tying reeds for letters. He said before him, Master of the universe, who is slowing your hand? He said to him, there is a certain man who will be in the future after many generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name, who is destined to derive from every single stroke piles and piles of halachot. He said before him, Master of the universe, show him to me. He said to him, turn behind you. He went and sat at the end of 18 rows. He did not understand what they were saying, and he despaired of strength. When they came to a certain thing, his Rabbi Akiva's students said to him, our teacher, from where do you know this? He said to him, it is a law of Moshe at Sinai. And Moshe's mind was calm.
Okay. So the setting is that you should remember this is going to happen. This is set in the as a spin-off, and Norm, you asked earlier about Midrash. There's a little bit of a gap, or a gap for imagination that is ripe for imagination. The end of Parshat Yitro, we have the Aseret HaDibrot, and the people make altars, and they have a special festival. It's the good altars at this point. Moshe goes up on the mountain to great fanfare, and he goes up, and he is up there for 40 days and 40 nights. And we start with Parshat Mishpatim, and we get all the instructions for building the Mishkan. There are lots of great stories about how Moshe gets up there. But one of the questions that our sages had was, well, what did Moshe find when he went up on the mountain? God is giving him the Torah. It took 40 days. What was he doing for 40 days? Certainly God could have just handed Moshe a copy, and that wouldn't have taken 40 days. So one of the things that it may answer as a question, as a midrashic question, is what took 40 days up there? And when Moshe gets up to heaven, he sees that the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, is kosher ketarim la'otiyot. And that could mean putting, one of the ways of imagining this is that if you have seen an open Torah scroll, which I hope everyone has, you know that there are each of the letters, not each of the letters, 7 letters. Oh, I can't remember the acronym for it. Sadi? Gimel. Gats is the last one. There are 7 letters that get crowns. Shin is one, Aleph is not, Hey sometimes, Chet. Certain letters get little crowns on tops. I was once in the synagogue at Camp Lejeune Marine Corps Base in North Carolina, and they had the most beautiful Sefer Torah I've ever seen, because whoever the scribe was, it was an older Torah scroll. Whenever there were crowns on the top line of a column, there was this cloud of peacock feathers that was just the most gorgeous thing. And it was a scribe that was clearly having fun. And apparently it's very, very difficult to do because the crowns can't touch each other, or it makes the letter pasul. So whoever did this was actually a very skilled scribe. But one of the questions is, why do we have these letters that have the lines on the top? And so midrashically, one of the things that this story comes to answer is, what are those lines for? As well as potentially the question, what took 40 days? So the Kadosh Baruch Hu, you could say, was drawing these lines on top of each of the letters. The Torah was definitely ready, that God was ready to give it to Moshe, and that's what the beginning of the speaking of the Aseret HaDibra were, that all of Bnei Israel heard. And then they got a little bit wigged out, and they said, Moshe, maybe you could go get it for us, because this is a lot for us to experience. So he goes up on the mountain. So part of that was God putting the letters on the crowns. The crowns on the letters. One of the things that I think is also a different way to read it is that I translated it, instead of crowns, I translated it wreaths. Because it was something that you would tie. If you think about Caesar had a laurel wreath, or people who win the Olympics get a laurel wreath, and there are these that we call, in the kitchen, laurel is called bay leaves. It's nice and soup. But it was used already in the ancient world as a sign of victory, which I think was because it was the preferred tree of Apollo in Greek mythology. But it crossed laurel branches tied together in a little crown was a sign of divine favor and victory. So I translated it tying wreaths for the letters, so that it's like if you've ever been to someone who's putting together the little bags of spices for a bar mitzvah, for Havdalah. You have a little party and everyone sits and you are tying a bunch of them until they're done. Or something for a wedding, a similar thing, little bags of candy or whatever you do. So he's sitting tying these wreaths. And he describes to Moshe as something that's going to happen in the future that Moshe wants to see. Moshe miraculously gets a chance to be in Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash. I want to ask you to describe for me, what is the Beit Midrash like, if you can imagine from what is going on here?
It has 18 rows.
Has 18 rows. Good. What else?
Teacher stands in front.
The teacher stands in front. Why do you say that? I'm going to agree with you. I think that's in there.
Because Moshe's sitting in the back.
Correct.
So.
Yeah, without the 18 rows coming, I would have thought like sitting in a big circle, or like just a big group of people, no order, with Rabbi Akiva as one person around that circle.
So, interesting. Okay.
That's what I would have imagined.
So you imagine more fully circular egalitarian, so everyone can participate equally.
Right, and see each other.
Yes.
Except for this 18 rows coming.
So why did Moshe sit in the back of the room? I mean, we probably have here 25 rows. And on an average Shabbos morning, the first 3 rows are underpopulated, although in the middle people sit in. But people tend to sit more in the back. Why did Moshe sit in the back of the room?
He wasn't familiar with this. He didn't want to interrupt anything or disturb anything.
Okay? Do you envision the room being full or sort of like Chazarat HaShatz on Shabbos morning? So, 15% with sparse population and like 20% overcast chance of rain kind of thing.
I think it's full.
It's full.
Like a fully packed room.
Okay, because you need 18 rows to accommodate everybody.
Well, I'm thinking more because of Rabbi Akiva and the image I have of
Oh, yeah.
the following he had.
And we're gonna look at that story as our third story tonight. So we know about Rabbi Akiva that he was a popular teacher and had many students. And if there are 18 rows, it must be that people are packed into this room. So maybe Moshe can't get close. What do you imagine about Rabbi Akiva's way of teaching?
He lectures and people ask questions.
Okay, good. Because you can assume that he lectures because there are rows and people are facing him. We know that people ask questions because he makes a statement about something and they want to know where it's from. Something else I'm going to point out is that I'm going to ask, why is Moshe desperate? Why does he despair? If people are asking questions, why doesn't he just say, can you say that again?
Because they move so far beyond his experience with the Torah. I mean, over the years, it changed in the way they learn it, and not necessarily advanced, but in very different ways, or as technology. But as things change, you have to apply what we learned to other things that he didn't. There are a lot of things he didn't understand.
Excellent. And I'm going to go back and you said not technology, but I'm going to point out that language is technology and logic is technology. Those are things that had to be developed in human culture. So it is possible that he is technologically way behind and he's going in, has no idea how to even participate in what's going on. And he gets depressed because he doesn't get it.
Well, I would say something else. Not just he doesn't get it, but that he would have thought that everything came from what he did, and it was disseminated among the people, and they have it. And now he's seeing the Judaism that's not anything like what he knew, and he's worried that they changed what he started. Like the people have changed God's word that he passed on. And
who was I talking to? Oh, yes. That could be a critique of a fundamentalist community. So, for example, if you were a Karaite in Eretz Yisrael in the 8th century, Rav Saadia Gaon came from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael, where he had to deal with a lot of Karaites in the Federation, as it were. And then he came to Bavel, and it was a totally different scene. But that could be one challenge to Rabbinic Judaism, that you're not doing what Moshe says, not what's in the Torah. It could also be a challenge by that point, arguably, of Christianity. From Christianity against Judaism. So maybe it's not the same Judaism. And yet, Moshe is reassured it actually is the same Judaism. Norm?
It seems like the scene is a very slow action. God was just sort of playing with this thing. And he started getting anxious to see something that he can use, or why is he there? You might be wondering why is he there.
And bearing in mind, because this story comes when Moshe is up on the mountain, one of the questions that has to be answered for Moshe, for our rabbis and for Jews in our rabbis' period, is what did Moshe think was going to happen with his Torah when he came down? Did he wonder what Judaism was going to be like in our day? And what would he have thought if he saw how we live? And that gets resolved because Moshe gets to see the best of what happens with Torah, There are discussions in a Beit Midrash that are so far beyond Moshe's technological understanding of Torah, even though he, as it were, he didn't invent the Torah, but he brought the Torah down from heaven to humanity, which was a very big deal in the ancient world. Don't forget, in ancient Greece, what happened to Prometheus, who went up to heaven and brought down fire. They chained him to a rock, and an eagle ate his liver out every day until it grew back. So that was not such a good outcome. Moshe ate his own heart out for the next 40 years, which I suppose could be less good or could be better. But he got to see that Torah was going to continue living, and not only living, but people were going to actively engage it. And they were going to do so many things with it. And nevertheless, this is the Torah that Moshe brought down from Sinai. So that there's a great parable in the Torah. No, it's in Midrash. I think it's in Vayikra Rabbah. There are two servants that the master wants to see how good a servant each of them is. And he gives one servant a bag of gold and says, I'm going to want you to give this back to me. And the servant very carefully takes it and locks it in a box. And at the end of the month, or whatever the master says, brings it back and says, here's your gold. The master says, okay. And he goes to his other servant and he says, I want you to take this gold, and at the end of a month, you got to give it back to me. So the servant goes out, buys a field, buys grain, sows grain. At the end of the month, the grain has come up, maybe not a month, but at the end of the period, the grain has come up. He harvests it, sells the field, gets back the original purchase price of the field plus appreciation and the value of the crop of grain that he took in, and gives it back to the master and says, here's the original, and here's what it made. And the master said, now that's a good servant. So that for Chazal, the understanding was, and this is explicitly said other places, the Torah is no good if you roll it up and stick it in the corner and no one reads it. That's not what the Torah is for. The Torah is for taking down out of the ark and reading it and engaging it and making things come up from it. So, to get back to the culture question, in looking at this story, the people who told this story valued the engagement and the aggressive study of Torah and the building up of the technology of Torah study. They valued an understanding that the Torah that we are working with is the Torah of Moshe from Sinai. We are not arrogating to ourselves that we are creating a new religion. We are traditional. We are in the tradition of Moshe Rabbeinu, and we are building from that Torah. And we're staying within boundaries of what came down from Torah, even to the point where Rabbi Akiva proposes a halakha that his students are like, wait, how did you get there? I missed that jump. He says, you can't make that jump. This is something that is so ancient, it may not be in the Torah, but this is even oral Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu brought down. So that even the process of oral Torah, we know this. In the Torah, we have 6 examples where Moshe isn't sure what to do and has to ask God, what do I do now? And the Kadosh Baruch Hu says, that wasn't in the book, here's what you do. And the what you do that wasn't in the book is in the book. So that we understand that oral tradition has always been a part of how Jews live the Torah that came from Sinai. Bob.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit before, but assuming that translation here is right, there's something that continues to bother me. So we've talked about Halakha Moshe Sinai. You make the point that it is not derived, that it's something that was passed on and not derived. And here it says, again, if the translation is right, that the Akiva will derive Halakha from the Torah.
Yes.
What were they doing in the yeshiva? If they were deriving a halacha, then why did he say, oh, don't worry, it's Moshe Sinai?
So deriving halacha is, I just think of it as, so now apparently Legos, when you get a set of Legos, the way that Lego has really made its market is that it sells super hyper-specialized sets. So this builds an X-Wing fighter and has exactly the instructions to build that one thing. And then kids build it and it goes on the shelf, and now they want a different Lego set that builds something else. Legos, the other way of going at Legos, and the way that Legos were when I was a kid, was You get a big box that has 80 yellow things that have 4 by 2 and is this thick. And then 40 that are skinny ones, kind of flat. And then you can build a ton of different things with them. And the fun of Legos is you build a thing and then you take it apart, and with the same building blocks, you build something else. So that the Torah was fixed, and that Rabbi Akiva was particularly known for deriving meaning from things that were so small, from etim, achim, and rakim, that other expositors of the law might say, the easy one that comes to mind is from the first parak of Kiddushin, Kicha Mistei Efron, Ki yikach isha uve'ala, and Vayikach Avram et hasadeh mi Efron achiti. So that because it uses the same word, you know that the same way that I acquire the right to have marital relations with a woman from her can be done with giving a gift of money, because when I acquire the right to a field, I have a case where someone gives money. And that vayikach in different settings goes together. Rabbi Akiva went even beyond that. And the hyperbolic statement is that even those teeny little lines was enough for Rabbi Akiva to say, oh, there's a line here and there's a line there, and therefore I can take meaning from it. It was maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, except insofar as that we understand Rabbi Akiva to be someone who valorized and represented the potential for Jewish intellect for making meaningful Jewish living out of how the Torah is built, with the understanding that in the intervening generations between Moshe and Rabbi Akiva, it was a very different world. So much so that at the end of the story, Rabbi Akiva, who is this paradigmatic figure who creates opportunities for Jews to live intensely Jewish lives, is nevertheless executed by the Romans in the marketplace in a really debased and horrible fashion. And that's how different the world is. That Moshe Rabbeinu, when he dies, although he doesn't yet know it, dies with the kiss of God himself. And you would think that Rabbi Akiva, all the more so, and because we know that Moshe Rabbeinu dies al pi Hashem, which the rabbis understood to be literally with a kiss from God, that Moshe Rabbeinu, the world has so changed that someone who is as great a scholar as Rabbi Akiva was would nevertheless be allowed to die horribly in the marketplace, and that the world is that different.
Sort of related to that, you used the word progress to describe what Akiva was able to do. Do you think they conceived of it as progress?
I think that they understood that there was a difference in the technology of how they were deriving halakha. And I think, although this may be a longer conversation for another time, in some, there is an often taught and sometimes taught to death sugya in Bava Metzia called Tanur Shalachnai, around the Tanur Shalachnai. And it's about how Rabbi Eliezer gets up and he says, the halacha is like this, and they don't want to do it that way, and they disqualify. And he says, the halacha is like this. The story that bookends with that is in Sanhedrin 68a, when Rabbi Eliezer dies. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is the paradigm of tradition. And it is said of him that he never repeated a halacha that he had not heard from his teachers. So he had a tradition. So it's like at the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Moshe kibel Torah miSinai u'Mesora leYehoshua Mesora lezkenim. That there's direct tradition. It gets handed down. Rabbi Eliezer was the one who personified having a tradition, a shmuah, from his teacher, from his teacher, from his teacher, all the way back to Moshe. And the story in Bava Metzia is about a shift in Beit Midrash technology to valorizing 13 principles of
Rabbi
Yishmael, but it's called something else. Rhetoric. The application of rhetorical principles for expanding the derivation. So the idea of logical exposition in tension with tradition. And that generation, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was one of the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who escaped from the destruction of Jerusalem under Vespasian. The Jewish world had a massive revolution in 70. And as part of the response to that, the way that Jews lived had to change because the world blew up. And the way that Judaism responded to that explosion of everything they understood in the destruction of the temple as the founding, really an embodiment of tradition. You could go to the place and do the things and offer the sacrifices. And that went away, and Judaism had to survive somehow. And the way that our sages understood was that in addition to tradition, we have to balance that with logical exposition and rhetorical exposition. And that is a progression. It's a shift in how Judaism survived, with an understanding that those principles, and this was what those sages understood, is those principles were an inherent part of the Torah. Those kinds of discussions were practiced before the destruction of the temple. It was not new technology per se, but the emphasis on it and the welcoming of it and the expanding of it was a huge embracing of that technology in that generation in a way that was very painful for someone like Rabbi Eliezer. And he, in those two stories, he has no place in the new community. So they have to kick him out. They have to kick out the voice of Masorah in order to make Judaism survive. And it's very painful for them also. That being said, sorry, did that answer the question?
Yes and no. It's progress in the sense of progression rather than progressive.
It was also progressive. And I'm not making a value judgment of it to evaluate or to make a value of what progressive means. Conservatism was, my teacher said, what his teacher said was his teacher said. And there is no change. If I have a Masorah, then we have it. So when they wanted to eat a certain amount in the sukkah without saying a bracha, without washing your hands, at a certain point Rabbi Eliezer gets up and walks out of the sukkah. Because the Judaism is changing and evolving, and he is progressing beyond Masorah, and he can't be part of that.
Yeah, I meant that in the sense that it's the recognition that things are changing versus the belief that things are changing and getting better. Which is, I think, how progress is something. You seem to definitely put it in the first part.
I think it is definitely in the first part. I have no way of assessing whether they thought it was better.
Okay.
And I think that they understood that it had to happen and there was bittersweetness around it.
Yeah, got it.
I want to read the second story also and then give you some context for what those storytellers are saying. So we understand that the storytellers value rhetoric. We're talking about an academy with a lot of students, and there's an understanding that what they're doing may be very difficult to understand, but is nevertheless very important. Let's look at the second story on page 1, please. Will someone read that one?
When ASBI went to Israel, he found Rabbi Yochanan, who said to him, "Who is the head of teaching in Babel?" He said, "Abba Alicha." He said to him, "You call him Abba Alicha. I remember when I sat 17 rows behind Rav, who was in front of Rabbi, Yehuda Nasi, and sparks of flame came out of Rav's mouth into the mouth of Rabbi, and from the mouth of Rabbi into the mouth of Rav. And I had no idea what they were saying. And you call him Abba Alicha?"
So you should know that Abba Aricha's more regular name was Rav, which sort of he was one of the first generation of Amorim in Bavel. Rabbi Yochanan is technically second generation Amora Eretz Yisrael. But we have someone who comes from Bavel. Is the guy coming from Bavel a rabbi? Why not?
It's not called.
He's not called Rav. So in this case, I think it is a specific, intentional, whoever he is, he's not of the chevra, of the category of rabbis, of the class of rabbis. Rabbi Yochanan says to him, who's the head of teaching in Bavel? And he says, Abba Aricha. What is familiar in this story to our first story?
The rows.
The rows. There are 18 rows because Rabbi Yochanan, presumably, when he was a student in Bavel, sat in the last row. He's in the back. Next, he's standing just in front of where Moshe Rabbeinu would have been standing. What do you think that tells you about Rabbi Yochanan's status as a student in Bavel? Was he the teacher's favorite?
No.
No.
Not that. At least not that year.
Not that year. If he was sitting in the 18th row, he could hear what was going on in the first row. What was going on? Who got the attention of the teacher in an 18-row yeshiva?
The first row.
The first row. Who got to sit in the first row?
The top students.
The top students. By the way, this is a story in the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan is one of the greatest sages of Eretz Yisrael. What do the Babylonian sages think of themselves as opposed to the sages of Eretz Yisrael? They're way smarter. The best Eretz Yisrael rabbi sat in the 18th row, by the way. We're going to come back to that in a second. There was so much holiness going on that they were shooting sparks at each other, which in this case probably reflects dialectic. They were speaking so powerfully that it was like flame, that no one else could get close and that it was dangerous. So dialectic can be dangerous. You might not want to get close. It'd be pretty to sit from the back and watch, like fireworks. Like you want to sit back and get the boom, but you don't want to be right next to where the ones that are going off, because the sparks will catch you on fire. Okay. Please flip on to page 4. Rabbi Natan Abavli visits Bavel, oddly enough. He's not from there, in the 10th century, in a period of the Geonim. So this is late in the Babylonian period, and he describes the yeshiva that he sees. It seems that the yeshiva of the Babylonian Geonim reflected what came right before it. So it was built on structures that were already in place in the Talmudic times. Tell me what sounds familiar from this. He's describing the yeshiva, and this is the order in which they sit. The head of the academy stands at the head, and before him are 10 men comprising what is the first row, all facing the head of the academy. Of the 10 who sit before him, 7 are called heads of the Kala, and 3 are associates. And the 70 comprising the Sanhedrin are the 7 rows. The first rows sit, as we mentioned. In the back of them are another 10, and so on until there are 7 rows of 10, all facing the head of the academy. All the disciples sit behind them without any fixed place, but in the 7 rows, each one has their own seat, their makam kavua, as it were, and no one sits in the place of his colleague. That's a very big deal. When the head of the academy wants to test them in their studies, they all meet with him during the 4 Shabbats of Adar. He sits in the first row, recites before him, while the remaining rows listen in silence. When they reach a section requiring comment, they discuss it among themselves, while the head listens and thinks of their words, considers their words. Then he reads, ignore the 20, and they are silent, for he knows they already understand what their disagreement is. When he finishes reading, he expounds the tractate they study during the winter. Sometimes he asks them the interpretation of laws. They defer to one another, and then the head of the academy asking him the answer, and no one can speak to him until he gives permission, and then each one speaks according to his wisdom. You can read the rest after. In the Babylonian Gaonic Academy, the top scholars sit in the front row. The Rebbe stands at the front. There's some conversation, but the one who has the greatest wisdom sits at the front. There is conversation that goes on among the top scholars, but if you're in the back and you're in the hoi polloi, you're watching the sparks go. You have no idea what's going on. these stories, one of them is a story about Moshe Rabbeinu. All the way back, he's coming forward in time to Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash. But the story wants us to know that what happens in Bavel is absolutely how they saw the history of Torah. What we do has always been this way. Possibly in the same way that oral Torah has always been this way, but what we do is the highest technology of oral Torah, teasing out the slightest possible meanings. And by the way, not everyone gets to do it. It's okay. If you're starting out, you're in the back, and you're not going to understand what's going on. But keep coming. You shouldn't worry. Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't know what's going on here. But if you're very, very, very good, and you can already sit in the 18th row, you're still not going to know what's going on, but you can still someday have it, you can become a Rav. Rabbi Yochanan did it. So even though we know that Rabbi Yochanan is, none of us is ever going to become Rabbi Yochanan, nevertheless, he started in the back and worked his way hopefully forward. And this is the reality of the academy that the sages lived in. Let's go to page 5. It's important for me to read this story because one of the things that we would otherwise miss without a story like this is what it was like, is the fact that these were stories told by men in the academy. Men were the only ones in the academy. And there's a series of these stories in Ketubot, which culminates with this story. I wanted just to pick one story and bring it there. There's a series of stories of what happens when you are a sage who doesn't live up to your family obligations. In this particular story, we have a sage. We have Rabbi Akiva, and how he became Rabbi Akiva. And how did that happen? Rabbi Akiva, in the case of Rabbi Akiva, the daughter of Kalba Savua, who we'll know elsewhere was a super rich guy, betrothed herself to him. Kalba Savua heard and made an oath so that she was not allowed to have any benefit from her property. His property, he totally disowned her. He didn't approve of who she married. She went and married him. After they got engaged, she got disowned. He said, I don't care, I'm going to marry him anyway. And she goes and marries him. In the winter, they slept in a barn. It's the only place they could find. And he, Rabbi Akiva, not yet Rabbi Akiva, would pick straw out of her hair and said, if I had it, I would adorn you with the Jerusalem of gold. I would buy you a very fancy piece of jewelry, which was a crown that wealthy men could buy for their wives, that was tall and maybe looked like a city wall. While they were there, enjoying the benefit of having straw in the winter, Elijah the prophet appeared to them as a man who called at the doorway and said to them, bring me a little bit of straw. My wife is giving birth and I have nothing upon which to lay her down. And Rabbi Akiva says to his wife, look, there's a man who doesn't even have straw, and presumably they give him straw. And in that, his wife sees, he's a man with such a good heart that even though they're desperately poor, he's willing to give what little they have to someone who really needs it. And she says to him, go and study in the teacher's house. He went and he studied for 12 years in front of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. 12 years is a long time away from home. At the end of 12 years, he went to his home, and he hadn't even got home yet. His wife is out behind the house, he's behind the house, and he hears that a wicked person says to his wife, oh, your father did right. First of all, you married someone who's not your equal. You married below you. So of course you should have been disowned. And second, he has left you a living widow all these years. Where's your husband? He left you to go study Torah? Fet. Your father should have disowned you. And she says to that wicked person, if I had the chance, if he listened to me, he should go study for another 12 years. She doesn't know he's listening. He says to himself, hey, she gave me permission. And he goes back to the yeshiva for 12 more years. 24 years he's away from home. Who knows how long they were married? Probably not so long. Not more than a winter, because it was in the winter and they were in the barn. She's by herself with no news from her husband for 24 years, desperately poor, which we know in a minute. He comes back another 12 years later with 24,000 pairs of students. He's a famous guy. Everyone comes to his shiur, and everyone in town goes out to see him. And she, his wife, herself gets up to go see him, and the same wicked person says to her, "What are you doing? Where do you think you're going? Here's this important guy." Think about Cinderella sitting in the ashes, and the prince comes around with the shoe, and then wicked stepsister said, "Where do you think you're going? You don't even have clothes to go to the ball." Even so, she says, the wicked person says to her, "Where do you think you're going?" She says to him, "The righteous man knows." Now, I left the rest of it in parentheses because the pasuk in the Gemara as we have it is from Mishlei, "The righteous man knows the soul of his beast." It is probably the wrong pasuk. The correct pasuk for Mishlei is Yodea Tzadik Nefesh Dalim. And that actually the wrong part got filled in. That the righteous man knows the soul of the oppressed. It's okay. He's going to know how much I've suffered all this time. She came to appear before him. She jumped out in front of, imagine, I don't know, the president going down the street and the Secret Service has got the whole street blocked off and someone jumps out in front of the car. So they're going to tackle that person and hustle them away. So imagine that. This poor woman who has been living in poverty with who knows how she's been making her living for 24 years. Think of the gift of the Magi that she sells her hair. And that's in, I think, of Rabbi Natan, that she has to sell her hair. She sells her braids to make money for the family. She's desperately poor, and the sages say, you poor woman, get out. This is an important man. And he says to them, leave her. What is mine and yours is because of her. All of the wealth that we have, the Torah wealth that we have, is because of her. The father-in-law hears that this important man has come to town, comes and is absolved of his oath. He made an oath that his daughter should never enjoy property from him. He is allowed to give his daughter his property, and therefore his daughter is allowed to share her property with her husband, which is an important part of this sugya, which is about how sages who are wealthy, who are very poor nevertheless, are able to be sustained despite the fact that they're studying. Relevant point here is it was understood in Babylonia that what sages were able to do when they went away to study at the yeshiva, if they were, was because their wives made sacrifices at home. Sages in Babylonia left their wives to study. They had to travel potentially very far distances. We don't have those in the stories of Eretz Yisrael. Why not? Bavel's really big. Eretz Yisrael is only the size of New Jersey. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, it takes a while to walk from Cape May up to Trenton or to Newark, but you can get there. And Bavel is much bigger, so people would live at some distance maybe from the city. If you wanted to study and you were male and you wanted to go to the academy, you had to go to the capital and you would leave your family for a while. And you might or might not remember to get news back. It's important. I just want to make sure that we look at that to remember that as we're having these conversations, there are other places where the sacrifices that men made to study Torah to be in the academy had impact on their family. I want to look at one last story and ask you to infer or to describe what you see about what we've learned about the academies and the people who tell these stories, the men who tell these stories in the academy, reflecting their experience. The last point that I want to emphasize is that stories in the Bavli are often based on or integrate stories from Eretz Yisrael, stories from the Midrashim. We see that. So, for example, Rabbi Chanina ben Toradion, which we read about him on Yom Kippur in the Martyrology, who gets wrapped in the Torah scroll, and they set him on fire, and he says that the letters are flying up. The story of his execution is told in the Sifrei on Dvarim, which is an early Midrash in Eretz Yisrael. It's told at much greater length than the Bavli. So, the Bavli, the sages in the academy know that story, and they keep telling it. They tell it a little bit differently. Sages in the Bavli often will take material from Eretz Yisrael sources, from the Yerushalmi, or from Midrashim, and they'll tell it a little bit differently. Just the same way they do with Baraita sometimes, with Shmuot, they'll say, if that's what it means, no, this is what he meant to say. But they'll tell the stories a little differently. So in the Yerushalmi, there's a story of Rav Kahana, who is a sage, an Amora in Eretz Yisrael, who spent time, he's an Amora from Bavel, who spends time in Eretz Yisrael. And in the story in the Yerushalmi, on page 2 it says the following. Kahana was quite young when he came here. Don't forget, came here. This story is told in Eretz Yisrael. Why do they call him Kahana? Because he's not a rabbi yet. He's going to be a big shot someday, but when he was just a pisher, he was Kahana. Kahana was quite young when he came here. This low-class guy saw him, and he said to him, "Hey, what's the word in heaven? You're so holy. What are they talking about up in heaven?" And Kahana responds to him, "The decree of that guy is sealed." And so it happened, and he died. You're going to tease me for being a scholar? I'll show you what a scholar is. I know what your future is, and you're going to die today. And it happened. Another one saw him and said, "Hey, what's the word in heaven?" And he said, "That guy's decree is sealed." And so it happened. So he has profound knowledge, and his words have power because his knowledge is powerful knowledge. He says to himself, "Why did I come? I came here for merit. I came to Eretz Yisrael to study, and I'm sinning. Why did I come? Did I come here to kill the people of the land of Israel? Let me go and go down to where I came from." Already they're talking about Eretz Yisrael as Aliyah. Again, don't forget, this is the Eretz Yisrael sages telling the story. Rav Kahana came here. He came because he knew that there was Torah here he couldn't get in Bavel. He came to do mitzvot, to merit being here. And the people who he encountered didn't respect him. They were a little low class, and it frustrated him. He was a young guy. He didn't have the wisdom to take it in stride. He came before Rabbi Yochanan, who was his teacher, and asked him a question. If a fellow's mother belittles him, and his father's wife honors him, so his parents are divorced, and he's kind of torn between two places, which should he go to? Rabbi Yochanan said, "Let him go to where they honor him." So Kahana went down to where he came from. He went back to Bavel. They came and told Rabbi Yochanan, "Kahana has gone down to Bavel." Rabbi Yochanan said, "Why did he leave without asking permission?" They told him, "That thing he said to you, that's how he asked permission." So, the student Kahana came to Eretz Yisrael because the yeshivas there were better. And he didn't feel like he could just leave. He didn't feel like he could leave at all. And he knew that in order to leave, he had to ask his Rebbe, "Can I go home?" But he didn't want to ask his Rebbe, "Can I go home?" He felt like that wasn't a good question to ask. So he asked him, actually a very intelligent question. He asked him a halachic question. And his Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan, answered him in a way that gave him permission, as it were, to himself. And his Rebbe was upset that he left. He was a good student. He wanted to keep him there as his student. And he is upset at losing the student, but the other students say, "Look at how much honor he had for you. As a student, he wanted to honor you by not asking you to give him permission to leave, because that would have been too painful for everybody. He was one of your best students. He knew it would have caused you anguish, so he asked in a roundabout way and then sort of took his own leave." That's the story they tell of Rav Kahana in Eretz Yisrael. We're going to go now to the story of Bavel. Keep in mind the things that we've learned in the other stories about how the Babylonian sages saw what it was to be in the academy, how they thought of themselves with respect to other sages, particularly to Eretz Yisrael sages, and what they thought about the sacrifices that it took to study. The preface you should know is that there's a case that goes on where someone threatens to turn over a Jew to the secular authorities, which is a very big deal late in the Babylonian period. You don't do that, the halacha evolves, and it's taken very seriously. Someone comes to court, and Rav says to this guy, "Don't turn over your fellow to the non-Jewish authorities." And the guy says, "I'm going to turn him over anyway." And Rav Kahana, who's there in the courtroom, gets up and he hits the guy and kills him. So I'm going to read, and I want to ask you to think about, as you hear or follow, what are the things that are familiar to you that we've learned about how the Babylonians would have been involved in the story. Rav said to him, So the story starts in Bavel. Kahana, until now there were Persians who don't care about bloodshed. And now there are Greeks who care about bloodshed and call it rebellion. If you kill someone, it's a really big deal, and they're going to come down hard on the community. Get up and go to the land of Israel, and accept upon yourself that you will not challenge Rabbi Yochanan for 7 years. What is Rav's expectation of how good a student Rav Kahana is from the beginning? High. Because he knows, he expects that he could challenge Rabbi Yochanan right from the beginning. And that would be the job of the top student. Rav says, you're going to go there, you're going to be the best student, but just zip it. Which may be penance for something that happened in Eretz Yisrael. The commentaries go into that. Rav Kahana goes to Eretz Yisrael and finds Reish Lakish, who's Rabbi Yochanan's lieutenant, and the second best scholar in some, they're bar plugta. They're up there with each other. Found Reish Lakish sitting and completing the daily lesson for the rabbis. He, Kahana, said to them, "Where is Reish Lakish?" And the student said to him, "Why? Who are you?" He said to them, "This and that challenge, and this and that answer. I overheard while he was talking to you, and he said this, and I have this, and he said this, and I have this." But he's not challenging the teacher yet. They told Reish Lakish about him. Reish Lakish went and told Rabbi Yochanan, "A lion has come up from Bavel. Let the master carefully review the session for tomorrow." What is Reish Lakish's expectation? First of all, what does he know about Rav Kahana?
He's from Bavel.
Number one, he's from Bavel. What else does he know about him? He hasn't spoken to Rav Kahana himself. What else does he know about him from the students?
He's a lion. He's very smart, I guess.
He's really smart. And what's Reish Lakish's concern?
That he will challenge the teacher. So he has to change it or make it better.
Because if he doesn't make it better, what's going to happen?
He will challenge.
He's going to challenge this good student who comes from nowhere is going to challenge him and is going to embarrass the teacher because he's not going to be ready. Shame was a very big issue, by the way. We didn't talk about that yet. But being shamed in academic discourse was a huge issue for the sages in Bavel. The next day, they sat him in the first row before Rabbi Yochanan, who set a tradition, and he didn't challenge. Set a tradition, and he didn't challenge. He sat him back 7 rows until he sat in the back row. Sounds familiar?
Yeah.
Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, "Ha! The lion you described has been made into a fox." So fox seems like it was a nebushi creature. We know, is it in Pirkei Avot? It says, better to be the tail of lions than a head of a fox. Foxes were bad, were not good omens, but fox is a low creature and a lion is a high creature. Rav Kahana says, "May it be divine will that these 7 rows replace the 7 years that Rav said. Rav told me to keep my mouth shut for 7 years. They bump me back. How do I feel being sitting in the back row?" Embarrassed. And so, let this shame that I have being bumped back from where I should be, let this shame count in place of the 7 years that I was going to keep my mouth shut and not say anything. He stood on his legs and said to him, to Rabbi Yochanan, "Let the master return to the beginning. Do the shiur again." He set a tradition and he challenged him. So they moved him up a row. He set a tradition and he challenged him, and he keeps moving up and up and up. Rabbi Yochanan was sitting on 7 cushions. How many cushions? 7. How many rows in the academy? 7. So he's up at the front and he's on the top. And by the way, wealthy people in Babylonia would sit on a pile of cushions. 7 was an important number in Babylonia. Rabbi Yochanan, as the Babylonians are telling it, was an important person just the way they see important people there in Bavel. Rabbi Yochanan sat on 7 cushions. Rav Kahana took a cushion out from beneath him. He set a tradition, and he challenged, and he took a cushion out from beneath him. Until he took all of the cushions out from beneath Rabbi Yochanan, so he sat on the ground. How does Rabbi Yochanan now feel? He's been taken down 7 notches. Rabbi Yochanan was an old man and he had bushy eyebrows, and he said to them, "Uncover my eyes so I can see him." They uncovered for him with a silver mascara stick, with a small, like, imagine not a popsicle stick, but like a lollipop stick. It's an item that has halachic value in other places. He saw that Rav Kahana's lips were split, and he thought he was laughing at him. Rabbi Yochanan became angry, and Rav Kahana died. You don't want to anger sages in Bavel, because if they look at you wrong, they will kill you. I mean, that's other places in the Bavli. That was a power of Torah. The next day, Rabbi Yochanan said to the rabbis, "Did you see that Babylonian, what he did?" They said to him, "That's how he is. It's a cleft palate, or what's I guess called a hair lip. But that was what his face is always like. He wasn't laughing at you." Rabbi Yochanan went up to the cave where he was buried and saw a snake in front of it, circled, so holding onto its tail, preventing him to come in. He said, "Snake, snake, open your mouth and let the teacher enter to the student." It didn't open. "Let the colleague enter the colleague." It didn't open. "Let the student enter to his teacher." It opened its mouth and let him in. He prayed for mercy and revived Rav Kahana. He said to him, "If I'd known how this was how you are, I wouldn't have gotten angry. Let the master come with me." What's the position now? Totally reversed. Rabbi Yochanan, who was up in Eretz Yisrael on the cushions, is now going to the grave. He's almost going into the underworld, as it were. If we think about, who is it? Oh, Hercules helped a friend of his go and get his wife from the underworld, and it was bad. It was bad. Going to the underworld. This is a very different thing. He's going to the grave to pay kavod, but he has to abase himself, and then he prays. He comes back to life. He said to him, "If you are able to pray that I won't die again, I'll go with you. And if not, since my time has come, I don't want to be killed again. If I'm dead, let me be dead." He raised him and lifted him up, asked him everything that he, Rabbi Yochanan, couldn't understand, so that Rav Kahana solved them. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan says, "What I have said is yours," to his students. All of the Torah that belongs in Eretz Yisrael is theirs. It's from Bavel. When the sages from Babylonia tell this story, what in that story do you see reflects the lives that they lived and the reality that they had? We saw the Eretz Yisrael story that was different. In the things that we saw tonight, what could you look at and say, this is something that feels like it comes from Babylonia?
There's a rivalry going on there. It seems like the Babylonians think that the Israelites think that they're better than them.
Yes. And if you ask them in Bavel, their Torah is way better. The Bavli Torah is way better. What else do you see that reflects some of the themes of Babylonian academic that we saw?
Very hierarchical, competitive.
Very hierarchical, competitive. Remember the 18 rows from the other stories? Here we have 7 rows, but being moved back in a row is enormously shameful because it says you're not a good student. And the way that you are competitive and that you progress is that you move forward. Now, it's also, you can see this elsewhere. It wasn't so easy. By the time of the Geonim, you had to have yichus in order to get a seat in the row and know a little bit of something. You couldn't break into the rows. So when Rav Saadia Gaon comes from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael to Bavel and gets made the Gaon, it's a really big deal. He's a kid from the provinces, and there's no reason he should get that. And that actually was he had political problems in negotiating in Bavel because of that. Because they're like, who's this outsider? Where's this kid coming from? And he was also relatively young. You often didn't get to be Gaon until you were in your 50s or 60s. And then you were Gaon for a couple of years, because you had to wait until the next guy died. It was like getting a professorship at Hebrew University, Lahavdil. And so, in sum, as we'll wind up with that, the stories that are found in the Bavli are stories that include stories that are traditional stories, that the sages in Bavel received from Eretz Yisrael, received from long before. They reflect experiences that were part of the Jewish people. But when they went to tell those stories in the Bavli, they also told it from their own experiences, emphasizing values that were important to them, and making their values be traditional so that they understood that the way that they lived Torah was perhaps anachronistically described, but they understood that the way that they lived Torah was how people had always lived, was how Jews had always lived. And the way that they made that reinforced was by telling about Jews from prior generations living with the same values that they held high, even though the worlds that they lived in had changed and they themselves didn't have direct experiences of the prior world. When we go to read the Bavli, some of the stories are less polished, are really brought and mined from the history of tradition, but there are things that the stories in the Bavli often can tell us about what it was like to live in Bavel in the time that the Talmud was taking place. Tell us important things about how Jews lived, but even really more specifically, how Jews who lived in the yeshiva community, and probably were the men themselves who were studying in the yeshiva community, experienced and lived Judaism that has become the foundation and the bedrock of how we today live our Judaism.
It seems like the people from Babel looked at themselves as better than the previous generations. The way to describe even the first example with Moshe coming and sitting in the back and not understanding what they're doing, it seems like they are better. It seems like a very different mindset than the way we are today, or that we always say that we are worse than our previous generations.
Right. I'm going to massage it a little bit and say I'm not sure that they thought they were better than previous generations, but they believed that there was one place that the Torah could be found, and it wasn't in the Aron Kodesh. That the Torah in its totality was Torah Sheba'al Peh, which existed only in one place, and that was in the Academy in Bavel. And if you wanted Torah, you come to Bavel. We have the real Torah. Rav Kahana went down to Eretz Yisrael. He brought the Torah to them. The reason they have any Torah is because our Torah went out from Rav and Shmuel and went to Eretz Yisrael, and then he came back. Anything really good that comes from Eretz Yisrael is really based on Bavel. So they understood that Torah, real Torah, only happened in their academy, in the yeshivas, which is, practically speaking, not so different than thinking that they were better. But I'm not sure that it's a generational thing so much as geographic and cultural, how the Torah lived.
I think the 18 rows is a metaphor for that. Like 18 for Chai, Eitz Chaim. They're saying this is like life, Torah,
Yes.
in this room, in Bavel.
It could be.
The 7 in Yerushalmi, I mean, 7 days of the week, and Shabbat, and I don't know if there's symbolism for that or not. But.
Are there 7 rows in the Yerushalmi? It's in the Bavli, when the Bavli gets it.
Oh, that was Bavel.
And the fact that
Oh, it's both.
in the Yerushalmi there's no rows. In Yerushalmi,
Right.
Rev Kahana is a respectful student who is concerned about his teacher's feelings. And he goes and he asks him in a roundabout way, I really want to go home. And his teacher doesn't really realize he's asking to leave. He can't imagine that his student would leave him because he's so fond of him. So it could be that there's something with Chai. I'm not sure how early they really are playing with Gematria. I was just reading a paper about that this week, trying to evaluate when Gematria really starts to come in and numerological significance like that. 7 obviously is very old because there are 7 days of creation. Not sure when the number 18 starts to become an important number for Jewish counting. I mean, obviously by the time the JNF, you're planting trees. That's very important.
Yeah. Another way to look at this, I think, is that it could have been Bavel they were self-conscious about not being there to Israel. So they made up this thing that, like out of being self-conscious, they tried to say, well, we're right to be here because we're better, we're smarter. Out of a self-consciousness as opposed to some other, like, we really are better.
Yes, and when you see there, where you see this intensely is around the conversations of being able to intercalate the month and declare Rosh Chodesh. Because even until a little bit later, that was something that had been reserved to be done by the sages in the Academy in Eretz Yisrael.
Right.
And it started to become problematic because the Karaites would mess with stuff. And that is one of the things around who has the power and what Beit Din is the powerful Beit Din that is wrestling back and forth in this period. And they do get to that point where they say, we're better.
Because we know when the real Rosh Chodesh is.
For instance.
And Rosh Hashanah as a result.
And then you start to see these conversations emphasizing that the Beit Midrash in Babel has been there since Yehoiakim was exiled, Yehonia. That there's a synagogue in Baghdad, if it's still there, Shafi Ativ is still, that they say was built with stones that Jews carried with them in Galut into Babylonia in the 6th century BCE. So that there has been, that the cream of the crop of Israel was exiled to Babylonia, and that was the founding of the academies, and the Jews in Iraq have been there since then. And if you ask Baghdadi Jews, they certainly have that sense of their communal history.
So that they carried stones from Israel? So that they would have part of Israel
From
with
the
them.
temple.
Not that they were forced to bring things by the Babylonians, but
That they brought
They went with
pieces
being
of the
part of
temple
it.
with them. And what that story also tells you is by bringing pieces of the temple, which was destroyed, they took something from while it was whole and reestablished, as it were, the sanctity of the temple
Right.
and the center of the temple sanctity in Babylonia, in the synagogue that was where the academy drew its authority.
Well, what did they tell themselves about the fact they weren't living in Eretz Yisrael? I mean, later times it was a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. And I guess this time it wasn't. But did they feel bad about
So you
that?
can't go
they were
to.
forced to. They were forced to.